pleasure, and my tongue clings to my jaws, and thou hast brought me to the dust of death. And I see why I put that one in a folder called fixed, or fix, because I'm supposed to fix the fade at the end. Well, come to chapter 6, verse 5 of Ephesians. Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, and singleness of your heart as unto Christ. Not with eyeservice, as men pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. With good will doing service as unto the Lord, but not to men, knowing that whatsoever good thing any man doeth, the same shall he receive of the Lord, whether he be bond or free. And it's a little word. Now, servants will take in several senses. I want to just check real quick the wrong. Okay. Let's see. We are in. That's strange. Okay, where is. There we go. All right. And we'll turn. There we go. All right. Let's see what it is. Daulos. That's slave. There's another word, diakonos, which means like a servant, like a household servant, like a butler or a hired man. But this means someone who is enslaved. You know, who is serving unwillfully, let's say. They'd rather be doing something else. Obviously, for an employee, the same rules can apply. I mean, and even more so because you have your freedom. Like, you don't have to be there. You get people who, I mean, and, you know, I know it's hard because there's some jobs and bosses that are not so great. And no matter how good a job you do, you can be despised. Sometimes you're despised because you do a good job. I've been at jobs like that. Where doing a good job is kind of like sticking your neck out for getting it chopped off. Because you're ruining the curve, so to speak. On the biblical idea of slavery, one of the things people are critical about the Bible in general is they'll say the Bible is justification for slavery. Now, the Bible can be the justification for many things. For many, many, many things you can justify in the Bible. God knows men have. But that does not mean, for one, just because you can do something doesn't mean you're doing it right. You know, someone could say like, well, you know, hedge shears can be used for killing people. You know? That's not the proper use of that implement. You know, a hammer can be used to bash someone's brains in. So just because you can use someone to justify something doesn't mean that that is the proper use of that thing. Meaning, like, doesn't mean it's giving a justification. The Bible does not justify slavery. What they would say is because it contains rules governing slavery and advice for people in slavery, that it is therefore advocating slavery. And in the antebellum South, the South before the Civil War, we had slavery in America, and I would say that they used the Bible to justify slavery, but it should also be said that the emancipationists used the Bible also, or abolitionists, whatever. They use the Bible to justify ending slavery. And you could use the Bible for either. I mean, I can use the Bible to teach you eternal torment, or I can use it to teach you what I think is the correct view, which is eternal death. So just because you can do something with the Bible or interpret it in one way or the other does not mean that is the correct view. There is a scripture, though, that is not difficult to interpret, that I mention very frequently, okay, in connection with slavery in the Bible, and it's something you should probably memorize. I've memorized it, because if you ever get into arguments with people, say, well, the Bible is used to justify slavery. Deuteronomy 23:15. This is the biblical fugitive slave law. And it's it is an excellent check on the excesses that are found in the institution of slavery. And what it says is this: thou shalt not deliver unto his master the servant which is escaped from his master unto thee. He shall dwell with thee even among you in that place where he shall choose in one of thy gates, where it liketh him best. Thou shalt not oppress him. Sorry. I really need to clear my throat. So, and caveats come to my mind, like, but it says, thou shalt not deliver to his master the servant which is escaped from his master. Meaning, if someone runs away from their service as a slave, they were not to be returned to their master. If that's the case, you might find it very difficult to hang on to slaves. But you got to remember, like especially you think like in the South, how would they have ever even compelled people to labor if everyone who ran away couldn't be returned? If we had a law like that in place, how could slavery have continued? It's like, well, I don't, I think it'd be very difficult to do slavery the way it was being done. But the way it was being done in the Old Testament often was someone would sell themselves into slavery to pay debts. So, like, I'll serve you for 7 years. If you forgive I owe you a ton of money. I can't pay it back. Or you could sell family members into slavery. And so slavery was not supposed to, it wasn't supposed to be a punishment. It was often a way of paying debt. And they weren't supposed to be animals. The way they treated blacks in the South, they treated them like animals. It's very different than slavery in the Bible. Slaves were not animals. They were human beings. You were not to despise them. You know what I mean? There was a lot of laws like that where there was limits and checks put on things, lest your brother become dehumanized in your sight. That was like the rule about the 40 stripes. No more than 40 stripes for any. That's the most you could punish someone. God that puts in 40 stripes maximum physical punishment. Other than putting someone to death. But I mean, if you're gonna put them to death, it's finishing the thing. It's awful in and of itself. But he's saying if you start beating someone beyond a certain number, you dehumanize your brother, and he becomes just like an animal to you. Or less than an animal even, because people treat animals usually better than that. That's one of the arguments in the South, that since slaves were valuable, they would be taken care of and blah, blah, blah. Not always so. Human nature being what it is, some people get in their heads that they are little gods in their little kingdoms, and they mistreat people. Well, the biblical law was that if someone ran away from servitude, you were not to return them. If it was so onerous they ran away, then they don't have to be there anymore. So it's a check on the power of the masters. because it gives the slave a veto. I don't know what it does about the debt or anything, but the point is, well, you can't be returned to your master. Maybe he could entice you with like, hey, I'm, a little bit different. I don't know. But when you think about that was the law of the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 23:15 and 16. If that was the law concerning slaves, then slavery must have been a very different institution. And therefore, comparing it to the slavery we found in the South before the Civil War is entirely unfair. It's like the nature of servitude can be wide and varied. And so I submit this for your consideration and encourage you as a Christian to know at least this much about the subject so that you can at least have something, because some people say, oh, the Bible says you can sell your daughter, and it's like that. That was debts and stuff. They didn't have bankruptcy laws. They didn't have a lot of the protections we have in our country. They had that. And slavery was something people did. Just like divorce. There's biblical laws of divorce. Now, some people in Jesus' time treat them like commandments. Because the Pharisees talked to Jesus, they said, can a husband divorce his wife for every cause? Or any cause? And Jesus said, no. Well, then they said, well, then how come he commanded them to give her a writing of divorcement? And Jesus said, he wrote that for the hardness of your hearts. If you make marriage so that people can't get out of it, they'll kill each other. Some people need to get separated. It's not like good or desirable or right. When I speak as a Christian, I always tell people, other Christians, you may not divorce. But that is like saying you may not commit adultery, you may not steal, you may not kill, you may not lie, and you may not divorce. But how come the Bible gives a commandment concerning divorce? Isn't that a tacit advocation of divorce? Isn't he, granting approval to divorce because he's got rules about it? No, it's what men will get divorced or kill their wives, and vice versa. To also the women kill their husbands also. In fact, if a woman does commit murder, how much would I bet most of the time it is her husband? I'm just saying. That's in fact most murders are husbands, wives, husbands, domestic affairs. People often kill someone they know. Boyfriends kill girlfriends. Girlfriends kill boyfriends. You kill people who you have, it's rare for someone to just kill someone they don't know. Because I don't know about in high crime cities. I just know, like, when I hear, there was a murder out here several years ago. And it was a husband and wife. I forgot who killed who. One found out the other one was involved in adultery. So, there's something else in this chapter I was very interested in. Oh, yeah. There's also an important, this verse 7. Edomites and Egyptians, their children being able to enter into the congregation of the Lord in their third generation. Which is interesting. Because I'm having people who take race way much into consideration coming in to my life again, bothering me. For whom it's the purity of the race is this strange, weird thing that they are, especially of the Jews, when it comes to the Jews, they just are very insistent that they be not the Jews. All right. Back to the passage in question. Good. All right, there we go. So, we get a little different picture of something. God, the law of God in the Old Testament has regulations concerning slavery, yes, but it is not. God did not create slavery. What happens is men get into debt and they sell themselves. God made rules about it. That's the idea in the Old Testament law. There was rules made, just like with divorce. Divorce was like, and Jesus said, Moses wrote this because of the hardness of your hearts. Same thing with slavery, that this was written for the hardness of men's hearts, because they will buy and sell one another. And then mistreat the ones who are bought and sold, but that wasn't to be allowed. The idea is like, let them work and pay the debt. They have to work. Some people can work for you and then they can go. Well, a slave is essentially someone who has to work for you. You know what I mean? They have to work for you. They don't have a choice. They're your workers. But even in the Roman Empire, a slave could save up money to become free. And how they would earn it, I don't know. Maybe with skill or something like that. If they were more than just some were enslaved for very awful purposes. Like to work in quarries and stuff like that. But that was usually punishment. We still have slavery today in that sense, because it's like a lot of incarcerated people are forced to work. Because as a punishment for their crimes, assuming they're actually there legitimately. Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters, according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, and singleness of your heart, as unto Christ. Singleness of heart means you don't have two purposes. He's saying, do the work you do in your service with fear and trembling, meaning that idea means with a sense of gravity. Obviously, you're going to annoy people if you're working like that. It's a metaphorical fear and trembling, referring to the idea of respect, reverence, with the appropriate level of understanding of your position. There's someone who's over you. Remember, this is all written also during this. Paul had no authority to say, he says something like, slaves, you're free. You don't have to listen to your master. You start teaching that, the government's going to come down on you real fast. But he didn't have to teach that, because it's like, it wasn't required of a Christian to be free to be a Christian. You didn't have to, you could serve God right there in your service. He said, you can serve your master the same way you would serve Christ. And you'll be a better servant, and you'll probably have a better relationship with the man. Not with eyeservice as menpleasers, but as servants of Christ. There is that whole, oftentimes because of, and whether you're an employee or an involuntary employee, you have, the potential to want to people often put on a fake face for their employer. Yes, sir. And then inside they're like, I hate this SOB. And trying to do things just to please them, to see, so that they think, oh, yes, sir, absolutely. But doing it from the heart, meaning actually being, not being fake. But whether you labor voluntarily or, is there any of us that truly works voluntarily? Well, I mean, if you want to possess anything, you know what I mean? You got to work. You want a home, you got to pay the rent to the government. You got to pay property taxes forever and ever and ever and ever. You know? So if I want to keep the land I'm living on, I have to labor forever to pay the taxes. Fortunately, where I live, it's not very expensive. But some places where I hear how much property tax people have to pay, I think it's insane. You know, they're spending thousands of dollars a year in property taxes. I guess for the upkeep of the roads, and I don't know. For my couple $1,000, they keep the road up pretty good. It's usually plowed in the winter if I wait long enough. But you know, I like my low property tax life. Hope it doesn't go up majorly as I get old. But anyways, you have to pay to live, you know. We all have to work with our own hands in some way or the other. Just some of us have the option to travel, and you know, if someone's stuck in a place, it's like this miserable. But you know, there's what is now is not necessarily what's going to be. But if you make the most of what you're doing right now, the chances that things are going to improve for you in the future are going to go up. If you do a real good job for your master, you can advance potentially, or maybe not. I don't know. Or maybe just something will happen. Who knows? The Lord is in control. You have to remember that. You can't set your heart on what you don't know is coming. But you can have faith in the Lord that things will be better in the future. At least, you know, when I think of better, I don't necessarily think money-wise, but I think in terms of my ability to even bear temptation or bear trouble is going to be stronger, so that trouble won't be as troubling. And so no matter what state you find yourself in, as service or whatever, put your hope in the Lord and serve from the heart. You know, you think about what happened with Joseph in the book of Genesis. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, and then he served well, advanced in the house of his master, right, and was over all the house. And then the master's wife tried to seduce him, and when he refused, she accused him of rape. And he was imprisoned. Well, that sucks. You know, you get sold into slavery, you work your way up, you know, to the top of the heap. You know, you're over all the house. You're like the boss of all the other servants. Managing the guy's house, you know, not being mistreated, not like down in a salt pit somewhere, you know, doing mindless labor, but your talents are being utilized, you know, to the service of your master. You go, and then all of a sudden, boom, you're in prison because of the lust of somebody else. And then you're in jail. You know, well, and then he eventually got. But then the thing is, he's in prison. All right, that's worse than even being in, especially in the old days. It wasn't like our prisons. It's like the oldie prisons was not nice. You were meant to go there and die, essentially, you know, or they didn't want to execute you. They kind of, I don't know. Some were really awful. You know, dungeons and such. And so he was imprisoned. Eventually, you know, I don't want to go through the whole story. Eventually, he was free and rose to prominence in the house of the Pharaoh himself. So, you know, we don't know what's coming of where we are and what our, you know, everything that everyone intends evil for us, the Lord can turn to good. You know, so do not grumble when evil comes your way or when service is asked of you. It's difficult. You know, I know this is not easy to do. You know, I mean, it's not easy to just be like, oh, yes, I love service and from the heart feel it and have a single mind. I'm going to do my best and all that. It's not always so easy. But it is the best advice. I want to serve my master as if I'm doing the will of God from my heart. With good will. As unto the Lord, not unto men. I think we covered that pretty well. And knowing this, that whatever we do, when we do good, God recognizes it. Whether in this world or in God's kingdom. Whether we are free or bond, the Lord knows what we do, and He knows the good we've done. Well, God is fair. He's more than fair. He's gracious. So that's something we can be happy about. God isn't just fair. He's more than fair. He is gracious. He is good. And so, because that's how we get saved, even because He overlooks all the evil we've done. Just taking a look at all the good stuff. Figuring out how much to reward us. It's undeserved. Verse 9. And ye masters, do the same things unto them. Do the same things. Serve with a singleness of mind. As unto the Lord. A lot of employers have the attitude, good employers going to have the attitude that their employees are their valuable assets and people they're taking care of, and there's a service they need to do. Manage them as the Lord, or as they're managing, like if you were like, let's say, an overseer or a master of slaves or own slaves, you were to basically treat them as though they are the servants of the Lord and you are over them. Forbearing, threatening. Don't threaten. Obviously, if you don't threaten, forbearing, being, using negative reinforcement to get what you want out of people with threats. Knowing that your master also is in heaven. Neither is there respect of persons with him. He didn't care I was rich and I had slaves and blah, blah, blah. And some people could fault Paul for saying, like, oh, he didn't just free all the slaves. Again, I suppose you could say that. And he did seek the freedom of people. But like I said, like freeing slaves is complicated. We tried it, and I could bring it out. I have a little Bible. My ancestors shed blood in the Civil War, and the blood of my ancestors is on that little Bible. It's dated 1866, 65. Or I think it was 66, because that's the... What was it? No, that's the year the Civil War ended. It was like 1860. It was like the year it started or something like that. I forget. It was published right during the Civil War. It's the Bible that my family has handed down. A very small one, pocket one. They handed out to troops heading off to the Civil War, and it has his blood on it. Why did I bring that up? Well, just that. I've got somewhat to say about it. My ancestors were involved in it. My ancestors in America, the ones who go back the farthest, come from Maine. And Maine fought for the North, obviously being the northernmost state at the time, and sent a lot of volunteers down to fight in the Civil War. And but freeing slaves, it sounds great. Let them all go. And then what do you do with them? And also the fact that there's a lot of stuff riding on them. They were doing a lot of jobs. And a lot of times what they did is they ended up doing the same jobs, except as sharecroppers. And it wasn't necessarily as good for them. They were free, so that they had the potential to get, if you worked hard, you could somehow managed to get out of the the trap that the ex-slave owners were laying for them. They made this. The people are always trying to make systems that are advantageous to themselves at the expense of other people. And it's the heart of covetousness. They want to really screw the other guy so that they themselves can prosper. And but that's not necessary. You can have arrangements where everyone prospers. It's not a zero-sum game. Where there's only so much to go around. It's like because someone who is earning money is going to probably be more productive than someone who feels they're trapped and can't, And this was the case, they always talk about the South and slavery building America, which is nonsense. The South was a mess. I've read books from the time where they talk about in the South, a guy would walk across a creek every day 4 or 5 times instead of building a bridge over it. It's just the existence of slavery in the South led to laziness. Not of the enslaved peoples, but of just the regular peoples. They were backwards. There was not enough. There was no industry in the South to speak of. All the industry was in the North. All the ingenuity was in the North. That the notion that involuntary slavery brings about any sort of great prosperity or advancement is nonsense. Slaves are highly unproductive workers that must be threatened and cajoled into doing things. When you're miserable and nasty to them. Even if you follow the biblical, if you allow them to run away, if they don't like it, you probably get more productive workers out of it and treat them differently and say, look, you've been brought here involuntarily, but after 7 years, you'll be made free. You're on a new continent or whatever. I don't know. Kidnapping people for slavery never works out too good. So they had early in the colonies, they had indentured servitude where a man would pay for his passage to America by serving for 7 years as essentially a slave, as someone who was, but they were treated better because they were the same race and all that. And there was a lot of racist issues in that, obviously. And that's another thing, is the biblical slavery isn't really racist. Though it treated foreigners different than it did their own people. But who doesn't treat their own people different than they treat foreigners? Not that that's right either, because the scriptures say you shall not have 2 laws, one for you and one for the stranger. You're supposed to apply the same system of justice to the stranger as you do to someone who lives in your land. That's also in the law of Moses. Okay. So, if masters would make a better environment for their people to work in, people want to work there. And not only that, while they're working there, they're more productive and happy. And happy, productive workers are good for business. Slavery is not productive. It is not a happy labor. It's like, there's so many ways it could have been done better. And people talk about the cotton boom and all that. It's like, that's because of the cotton. They could have gotten more productivity out of their cotton if they had not had slaves. There's no knock on the people who were enslaved to say that the slaves weren't productive. It's just that slavery itself creates unproductive people. It creates a bad, nobody likes to be forced to do something they don't want to do. It's one thing when you enslave yourself, like say you sell yourself, you sort of like, well, I'm doing this, I need to pay my debt, or I want to go to America, or whatever cause that causes you to sell yourself into servitude for some period. At least a man who's enslaved for, 7 years. It's going to be a while. But in the end, I'll be free. And on a new continent. And there'll be opportunities. But for the black slaves, there was no possibility. They thought, my grandfather is still here, and I can see he's been a slave forever. And we're treated like animals. So they were very, if you treat someone like animals, they're going to be very unproductive. And so, in all their justification of slavery in the South, I don't think they much consider this, knowing that your master is also in heaven. You are God's slave. The free man is a slave of God. I am the slave. God owns me. I am bought with a price. The whole, you gotta understand, there's a reason the Bible doesn't forswear slavery, and neither does the New Testament, because we are all slaves of Christ. We are bought. We are already, because from the womb, we were sold. We are in a generational slavery servitude. All of us. We're enslaved to sin. We will serve sin. You will be a sinner. You will serve sin. Christ died and he laid his life down on the cross to buy us back from that servitude and to make us free. Make us free from sin, but also bring us into his own service, because he did not pay that price for nothing, just to free us like a bird to fly off into the wild blue yonder. He freed us that we might become his servants. So, Paul says this, in another place where he says, he that is, I don't know, maybe does he say it here? No. He doesn't get into it. But, what was I going to say? Oh, he that is a slave in the flesh is God's freeman, and he that is free is God's slave. Meaning that in a sense, you, in your servitude, you have freedom in Christ. Even though you're serving, you are free. You know what I mean? And that should be your mentality, is that you are free in Christ because of God. You've been set free from your sins. You have you're freed. It's like you're freed from the resentment of your bondage. You can make more of this. You have this opportunity with God to expand your life. But if someone is a free man, it's like they have to bring it's like, in a sense, you have all this opportunity, you have all this possibility as a free person. I could drink today. I drive by a liquor store every time I go out. Not that they're actually a liquor store. It's just there's liquor everywhere. It's like there's Walmart. They sell liquor there. There's it's everywhere. Temptation is everywhere. Right? But I am God's slave. I am bound. I'm not going to do that. I can't do that because the master won't allow. All the possibilities that are open to me are actually closed in the spirit. So the bondman is free and the freeman is bond. In a certain sense, obviously. I mean, you can look at it that way and derive comfort from it, because it should be, we should comfort ourselves in the Lord, in whatever state we find ourselves in. All right, we've got 20 minutes left, and it's like, now I've come to the armor of God. There's neither respect of persons with him. God does not respect persons. Whatever you are on earth, the important person you think you are. I remember someone tried to use this verse on me to talk about predestination. God has this predestination can't be true because God has no respecter of persons. It's nonsense. Because it's like, predestination isn't about respect of persons, it's about God's election. Respect of persons is when you're a king or a rich man, and you think in the world it gives you honor and respect, but God isn't impressed by any of those things. That's what respect of persons is about. I'm a king, I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm a politician. Do you know who I am? I'm a famous celebrity. You can't do this to me. Because people who are in those positions get this sense of entitlement. They think they're entitled to respect, to position, to deference. They think they should get special treatment. With God, there's no such thing. So just because you're a master, There's no respect. God's not going to like, oh, you're a master. Masters go here. Slaves over there. No, you're probably, if anything, you're in line for more scrutiny. Too much given is much is required. If you're given responsibility over a bunch of people, you mistreat them, the Lord will not be. The Lord is going to look on that with. He's not going to give you any preferential treatment because of your position. Let's just say that. I now we come to the passage, the part of this passage that deals with the armor of God. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Wherefore, okay, that's like the preamble. And that's probably all we're going to get to today, I suspect. Maybe not, I don't know. The armor of God is something I used to really zero in on as far as it's something that everyone likes. It's this lovely metaphor for, spiritual blessings and things you can do to yourself to arm yourself against the enemy. Right? Remember, the name Satan means enemy. Your enemy. Whatever is coming against you for sin, for trouble, for whatever, is in essence your enemy and is in essence a personification of the power of Satan. Just as the enemies of God or the enemies of God's people in the Old Testament, like the Assyrian, the Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the king of Babylon, those figures represent Satan. And that is why passages addressed to those figures are interpreted in our time as addressed to Satan. But a lot of people don't understand it properly. Like they'll read the Doom of Babylon in Isaiah chapter 14. And then they will, they'll get upset when like the NIV will translate the words Halel ben Shakar. I may not be pronouncing those right, but that's the Hebrew phonetic anyways, pronunciation of my memory, let's say. Bright star, son of the dawn, morning star, they translate that correctly, but they'll say, well, it should say Lucifer. Because the King James says Lucifer, and if they're changing it, it's like they're taking away the devil. The devil's still there. Why do you think that, in the book of Revelation, it's Mystery Babylon? The king of Babylon has a lot to do with Satan, the enemy. He was one of the greatest enemies of God's people in the whole record of Scripture. All right. But ultimately, he's going to cover this armor of God. We put it on to stand against the wiles of the devil. And let's, what are the wiles of the devil? No, I mean, literally, what is the, Methodia. Or methodia, probably more like. Craft or deceit. Interesting. Did you realize that method came from Greek? I didn't. Isn't that neat? You learn stuff like that. Method, derived from the Greek. So they probably call it the scientific method. A lot of scientific terms come from Greek also. Methodia. Craft. Or negatively, wiles. The methods of the devil. He has methods. He has ways. Careful when you say, oh, it means methods, because again, our idea of method doesn't really have any negative connotation in it, does it? But this word does seem to have some sort of, you know, like if I say the schemes. Now, scheme is not explicitly a negative word either, but it has a little more of a taint to it, you know, as far as it sounds like. If I say someone's got this scheme going, it has more of a sense of craft. Method, we think of someone being very methodical. Method is like logical and orderly and fashion. And it's like if I say, you know, he has a very complicated method to do this. There's no, like, people are going to think like, oh, but if I say it's a complex scheme, there's a little more of a like sense of like, ooh, a scheme, huh? And so it can, if someone is scheming, we have a negative connotation, whereas we say if someone is methodizing, we think nothing, because method is a very neutral term in English. And I think methodia sounds to me like is more in line with the English scheme, at least at this point in time, though we derive the word from the Greek here. The devil has different ways of approach, but it does mean he has different cunning ways of tempting us, of drawing us into conflict, of harming us, whatever. There's all kinds of things that Satan will bring against us, and therefore we take on armor. Armor is the purpose of what? To protect. Armor is to cover what? Your vulnerable points, you know? And then we're going to go into it in a second here. We're going to get into it. I'm not going to try to die over here in this one verse. Well, I will save the commentary on the idea of armor for when we cover the armor. Okay. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood. Ultimately, you know, our enemies take shape in flesh and blood form, don't they? So you think, of course I'm wrestling against flesh and blood. Most of my enemies are flesh and blood enemies. Most of the things that come against me in human form. You know, temptations come in human form. You know, the liquor salesman, I have trouble thinking of female temptations. What are they? I was thinking of, like, I always immediately go right to the commandments of, you know, thou shalt not lust and stuff, the things that men struggle with, but women also have carnal struggles, you know. Oh, the ice cream man is in town, you know. Ice cream itself, it is carnal. It is a solid thing. You know, I mean, all the temptations you look at are solid. I mean, like the tempting objects are flesh and blood objects, metaphorically speaking. Like, meaning this is a solid flesh and blood type thing. It's a physical object. But ultimately, it is not flesh and blood humans or the objects of our desire that are what we're wrestling against. You know what I mean? But it is against principalities, powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. High places, I've always understood to mean the heavenlies. Yeah, places is not really, notice it says Strong's there, because places is not in the Greek. It's just spiritual wickedness. Eporanios, of heaven. Of heaven. Against the spiritual wickedness is, the reason they don't say in the heavens, because it means of heaven. In of heaven. I mean, it's of a, and is that, what an interesting concept though. Like, wait. Let's not just blow over that. The reason they say in high is because it's like, they don't want to say like, is there spiritual wickedness in heaven? Well, it doesn't say in heaven. It's in of heaven. So what does he mean by of heaven? What I think it means is that the positions people occupy of power are ordained of heaven, it is said. You could not do what you do unto me except it were given you from above, Jesus said to Pilate. Right? So, I think it's invested, it means in the sense of in those who have received it of heaven. So it's not, what it's saying is we are wrestling against spiritual wickedness, against principalities and powers. And what that means, principalities, is going to be, well, I should get all the words out. It's going to be something like arche or something like that. Let's see, hold on. Arche, where is it? Arche, okay. Beginning, origin, or first things. Powers dunama, or no, exousias, authorities. Rulers. Cosmocrator. How about that? Rulers of this world. Oh, interesting. See, there's a little bit more here. Let me tell you. Cosmos, we get our word cosmos from it, the universe, cosmos. It means this world. The order, this world order, more than the world, the planet, or the moon and the stars and that kind of stuff, or the universe even. It does refer to the universe, but to the world in the sense of the world as it is, not to the world of things. But the way the world it works. The cosmos. So, Cosmocrator is world ruler of the darkness, Skotos, fine, of this world. Here is Ionos, or Ion, which means age, a space of time. So, rulers is Cosmocrators. It's rulers of this world, of the darkness of this age. There's almost a word missing here. Against the rulers of the darkness of the world. Against the rulers of the world of the darkness of this age. Against spiritual wickedness. Principalities. Things first, high, in position. The principal of your school is in charge of the school, right? Because he is the principal person, the first. The archangels, archdeacons, means the top, highest order, of the highest order. So, in the world, things are ordered. The world has an order to it. And there are powers, authorities in the world, given of God. Authorities, people in position of power, people in position of rule. Not just people, though. The positions themselves. Meaning the king dies, but the kingdom persists. There are ideas. These are things in the realms of spiritual wickedness. So there are ideas, ideals, systems of government, systems of power and control. As remember, Satan, when he took Jesus on the high mountain, he showed him all the kingdoms of the world, and said, "I can give this to you if it's in my power, in my authority to give it to whoever I will. I'll give it to you. Just bow down and worship me." And there's an interesting sort of interplay there, because we know that the rulers of this world rule at God's behest. Why is Satan in the middle of all that? Because Satan also belongs to God. You know what I mean? He's as much under God's thumb as anyone. It's funny. Like that aspect. I think that's why people are so in love with free will, because they like to imagine this heavenly conflict view of the world, where God is at war with Satan. Satan's in an active rebellion, and he's trying to overthrow God or some nonsense like that. It's ridiculous. Overthrowing God would mean the end of everything. It's not even possible. Satan is out to overthrow you. You know what I mean? He wants to be worshipped. He wants to sit in the place of God. He wants to be God in the sight of men. But he's not under any delusions about being God instead of God. That's silly. He never says, I will be God. He says, I will be like the Most High. I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north, which is Mount Zion. The place where Christ is supposed to return. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds into the heavenlies. I will be like the Most High. Like the Most High. He exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped. He exalts himself, but in the sight of men. He doesn't actually... The idea that he thinks he's going to occupy that position, he's going to be God, it's just mythology. The enemy of God seeks to take God's place. And ultimately, where is that place? Where is God's throne? The most important, God's throne, it ought to be, it's like, where do you want to go when you die? I don't usually talk in these terms, right? Because I don't believe, I want to live forever. I'm not really going to go anywhere. I'm going to live here. Or someplace like it. I'm going to live. Going to heaven is sort of like, I'm going to enter into God's kingdom, but it's not a place really. I understand this, or we ought to understand this, right? Where's God's throne? Is it in a place really? The ultimate place for God's throne to reside is in your heart. You know what I mean? You are the temple of the living God. Don't you know these things? And where the temple of the living God is God's house, where God dwells. If you have the Holy Spirit in you, God dwells in you. The Holy Spirit dwells in you. And the idea is you are his temple. And when Satan puts himself on the throne of God, he's putting himself on the throne of God in the hearts of men. When they begin to worship him as God, that's all he wants. That's what he wants. He wants to steal that, for himself. He wants to enjoy that, and God's going to let him do it. But he's not actually going to take God's place, or even I don't even think he's thinking that. He's not taking God's place as God. He's taking God's place in your heart as God. In your mind as God, in your beliefs as God. And so that your view of God becomes corrupted. And so that God becomes the enemy of God's people, Satan. So if I walk into my own house and my wife doesn't recognize me, it's like another man has taken my place in her heart. In a sense of like, if God comes back and we don't know who he is, and we're like, well, we thought this guy was God. We've been sleeping with him. You're the bride of Christ. I want to present you as a chaste virgin. So, Satan wants to enthrone himself in your heart, ultimately, and is given power in the world to set things up for himself. This is all the rule. The rulers are ordained of God. That doesn't mean they're good people. Sometimes he ordains their assassination as well. You know what I mean? So this guy, the divine right of king, and then even in our country, it's like we are ordained rulers, we the people, and we better do a good job because all our lives are writing on it. The wolves stand at the door, Run out of time. Well, it's a big important passage. Let's see if we can at least finish out this verse in the next few minutes. Well, principalities, powers. There's authorities, powers in the world, secular, religious, in education, right? That and not just the formal institutions. That's important you understand. When I'm talking about powers, and I'll say like education, it's not the formalized. I'm not talking about your school, though it happens there too. You know what I mean? But there is like other more subtle powers at work educating you. When I was growing up, like again, the first grade, I'm trying to learn to read, right? But instead, I get sat next to some little girl who has all kinds of dirty jokes, and I'm learning other things instead. You know what I mean? I'm getting an education. Some neighborhood kids show up at my door. I'm like 5 years old. And the powers of the world have come to educate me. They say to me, "Hey, Paul, you want to come with us to the park to look for some playboys? But don't tell your mother, she'll kill you." And then when we fail to find them, they say, well, I'm not going to tell the rest of the story. But anyways, you know what I mean? The world is there to give you an education that you may not be the one you're expecting. There are powers in place. Spiritual wickedness in powerful places. You know what I mean? They have power. You think how much power has been given to spiritual wickedness now with the internet. It's a wonderful tool for spreading the gospel, but also for spreading evil. It spreads all kinds of things. There's a lot of running to and fro and knowledge increasing going on here. But not all the knowledge that increases is good. We learn all kinds of things. There are all kinds of powers over us. There are all kinds of things in authority over us. Not just the institutions. When I talk about principalities, powers, and spiritual wickedness, I'm not talking about institutions, though institutions, that's the flesh and blood manifestation of a spiritual power that's behind it. You know what I'm saying? Like, when I say flesh and blood, to me, it's like it's not the Pope, though the office of the Pope, the idea of the Pope is getting closer to the truth. You know what I mean? I'm not particularly anti-Catholic. I'm not pro-Catholic either, I'll tell you that. But I mean, I'm not particularly anti-Catholic. Some people are very anti-Catholic. I'm not. No more than any other denomination. Well, maybe a little more than some, right? But a little less than others. I'm just saying, I don't like to. I'm not big on harping on, everybody. I want to teach the truth. But I'm no friend of formalized religion. And Catholicism is an exceedingly formalized version of religion, and therefore is rife with all the problems thereof. Like I said, I start to think in terms of all the people who are Catholics. And like I said, in the recent years, I used to kind of hate the Catholic Church because the power of the bishops and the Pope and all that and the cardinals and all this stuff I used to think like, wow, what evil. But then I see how this hierarchy gets infiltrated. It's been infiltrated for a long time by unbelievers, sodomites, and other such wicked men. Covetous, evil men are in power, and they infiltrate the hierarchical structure. They promote their friends, and pretty soon the whole place is, they call it the Velvet Mafia, because the Catholic Church is just completely overrun with homosexuals, actually. What do you think? That's why they've been covering up for those bad priests, because it's a rampant problem in their organization. I just feel bad for the rank and file. This is all going on above their heads, and the powers that are over them. And I feel bad for these people because they've been sincerely following their religion, and then there's all these wicked men coming into power, controlling it over them. and taking their money and now having to spend it to pay off their own, pay off paying recompense to the families of the people whose lives they destroyed. And at that point, I start thinking of the rank and file as kind of underdogs, and I always like to root for an underdog. I mean, I don't see them as... It's one thing when I'm looking at the bishops and the deacons and the cardinals and not deacons so much, but the cardinals and the bishops and the pope and all. You look at that and you think like, wow, the powers. But then you think about the people who are suffering, who are devout, who believe they're following the Lord as best they understand. I think there's a few names even in Sardis that have not defiled their garments. There's always people who have, there's always a remnant in any place where you're going to find people who are sincere and devoted, or for the most part. But get a big enough people, you'll find devoted people there, right? I believe that. I'm optimistic. And the rulers of the darkness of this world, there's powers over that, maintaining that structure, creating it, enforcing it, helping the wrong people get promoted. And this is also the Lord's doing, because he did not ordain the church as this flesh and blood carnal structure of power. It is, like I said, we are not wrestling against the carnal structures of power, which is good, because otherwise those things would try to crush us. We're wrestling against the spiritual wickedness behind it. By speaking the truth, we fight against the evil of the structure, but we don't have to go against the structure itself. If you preach the truth, the structure collapses under its own weight. Anyways. All right, we're wrapped up. We're going to continue with the armor of God. I think I got a nice intro there. We're going to pick it up with verse 13 tomorrow. And we might even finish the chapter, because it's going to wrap up pretty quick after we talk about the armor of God. But, every time I say that, I end up needing one more day. And I have no idea what we're going to do next, but we'll figure it out. All right. Thanks for joining me in this study. I look forward to being back again studying tomorrow.